the roll call. Joy Andrade.
Here.
Amanda Bryant.
Here.
Chris Clark.
Here.
Bruce is hopefully going to be joining us via Zoom. Diane Fleet.
Here.
Janice James is excused. TC Johnson is excused, but hopefully also going to join us by Zoom. Kathy Ploman is excused. Bo Revlett.
Here.
Liz Sheehan.
Here.
Alicia Branham. And Lella Still is excused. All right, we're going to go ahead and open first with any public and partner comments for issues on the agenda, which would be our competition documents. So this would be an initial point that we would be able to take any discussion from our partners on the tools before the board would discuss and hold a vote. Any comments? Okay. If not, we'll go ahead and do just a little bit of overview for our board, since we know that we have some folks who have been through this process before and some who are newer to us, and this will be their first COC competition. So we are trying today to go ahead and hopefully get approval of our competition documents so that we can officially open the competition. We will have a local sub-competition that will be for the provider agencies that are pursuing funding to operate housing and supportive services. And then my office will work on developing a collaborative application that will frame that competition and go ahead and talk about the broader strategies and performance of our system. And so these documents are for the local competition and give guidance on the application, ranking, and selection process. So just a couple of high points. You've had this document in advance, so hopefully you've familiarized yourself with it or can read on your own. But we will point out that under this year's competition, we will accept applications for renewal projects as well as new projects. In terms of new projects, those can be created through reallocation or through application for bonus funds. There would be a COC bonus and a domestic violence bonus. In terms of those projects, we can receive applications for rapid rehousing projects, joint transitional housing, rapid rehousing projects, permanent supportive housing projects, supportive services for coordinated entry, or homeless management information system administration. Domestic violence set-aside bonus funds can only be used for rapid rehousing, joint transitional housing, rapid rehousing, or supportive services for coordinated entry. If any existing programs would like to pursue a expansion project or new project with DV bonus funds, they can do so even if their current program does not exclusively serve survivors. However, the funding that they would potentially receive from the set-aside bonus would have to serve and target those that are survivors of domestic violence and stalking and human trafficking. If individuals want to pursue an expansion application this year, you would have to create a new application within eSNAPS and treat it as its own application. And then on the back end, if funded, HUD would combine your renewal and your expansion applications into one single grant agreement. Our priorities are going to largely reflect the priorities established by HUD and the priorities that we've operated with for several years now, including ending homelessness for all persons, utilizing a housing first approach, reducing unsheltered homelessness, improving system performance, partnering with housing, health, and service agencies, equity and inclusion, persons with lived experience, and increasing affordable housing supply. This year, Tier 1 is going to be set at 93% of our annual renewal demand, which means we have a little bit more funding this year that's going to fall under Tier 2. As a reminder, Tier 1 programs, those ranked in that are likely to be fully funded by HUD. Those that fall in our ranking within Tier 2 may or may not get funded and may not be fully funded. Typically, it's going to kind of depend on how much money overall that HUD has available and how our community scores. The higher we score, the greater the chance that we would be able to fund those projects. I'm just going to go ahead and acknowledge that Bruce Davis has joined us via Zoom, which means that we now have a quorum. Thank you, Bruce. You are the hero of the day. In addition, we have the ability to apply for $166,000 and some change in COC bonus funds. Those are contingent upon our community's overall application score. So anything that we can do strategically to increase our score on the collaborative application would increase the likelihood that we could add new projects with those dollars. Domestic violence bonus funds will not affect the scoring and ranking of other projects. If funded, they will be pulled out of the scoring and ranking, and all the other projects. Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Can you hear me now? You can't? Yeah, can you hear me now? Thank you. You saved the day for us. So if projects are going to be funded with DV bonus funds, then like I said, that would be pulled out of the scoring and ranking because they are a bonus set aside and everybody else would move up a rank. So those applicants would not have any detriment at all to our overall scoring and ranking. It's not going to knock somebody else out of getting funding if somebody wants to pursue those funds. Exciting news, we have the ability to apply this year for nearly twice the amount of COC planning dollars. So our community does plan to apply for the full amount and potentially look at if it's enough to sustain another staffing position within the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention. Decisions will be made by the COC's Program Performance and Evaluation Committee. That is a neutral party. They are going to have no members that would be affiliated with either the board of or employed by a provider agency. So those individuals will not be involved in any kind of a funding decision. We're not going to decide to fund ourselves. We will also point out the timeline, which is going to be on page 9 of the process document. We will vote to approve these documents today. If approved, we will go ahead and open the competition tomorrow. We have everything prepped to go live on the website, and we will have a competition deadline established of August 28th. At that time, your applications within eStaps need to be fully submitted and completed and delivered to our office. We would need the COC supplemental application materials. The Program Performance and Evaluation Committee is going to meet on September 5th to decide the final scoring and ranking and funding recommendations to be submitted to HUD. We will then bring those ranking recommendations as well as a copy of the collaborative application to the September 13th board meeting. So that's one timeline that worked out for no additional meetings. And as soon as that is approved, we will go ahead same day and notify our partners in writing outside of eSnaps of ranking and funding recommendations. The full application, including the final priority listing, will be made public 2 days in advance of the September 28th deadline. So full details of our process will be included in this document. As a note, this is not meant to be exhaustive guidance. It is intended to guide you through the local competition process. All applications need to be in compliance with the NOFO, and I would strongly encourage applicants to be familiar with that document. We will include links on the website to the NOFO itself, as well as detailed project documents that would help you to develop your application within eSNAPS. Additionally, included in the packet that was sent out on Monday is the proposed scoring and ranking tool for projects to be assessed. This would include both thresholds and rating criteria for new projects and for renewal projects. This year, we did make some changes. We first met internally within my office to talk about some strategies that we wanted to pursue, how we wanted to adjust the measures and the weights on those measures to encourage where we envision the COC going, and to make sure that we were fully in compliance with the requirements of the NOFO. We also quickly tried to bring together an event last week to engage some persons with lived expertise. We met some folks at the Lighthouse on Friday afternoon and completed some surveys and discussion, which we then went back in and adjusted the scoring and ranking criteria to reflect the input that was told to us to be most important to those with lived experience. So for example, if there was a particular performance measure that they felt was the best indicator of a successful program, we looked at trying to assign a higher weight to that measure than to others to make sure that their voice was also incorporated within this process. We hope that later in this process we'll be able to come back around and engage some folks in some additional discussion to make sure that the strategies of our scoring and ranking are in line with the needs and desires of those that are experiencing homelessness. Right now, I'll go ahead and open the floor if there is any questions from the board on our competition documents.
Could you highlight any of the more significant changes that were made to the scoring, or what the folks with lived experience suggested that we prioritize, just so we have the discussion about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you read the question? Just in case.
Yeah, just so Bruce could hear that. I know we're kind of working with a shoddy audio setup here. She asked about having us review some of the changes made to the scoring document, both just based on our own input and then that of individuals with lived experience. So in terms of applicant criteria, they felt the most important things were that individual organizations were able to effectively use funds to maximize the amount of persons that were served, and that an applicant have experience working with the homeless population. So we tried to reflect that in our scoring and ranking. We made sure that for new project applications, there are several different criteria that we typically utilize that would reflect things like financials and the ability to spend down. We also, for renewal projects, moved spend down from a threshold to a scoring criteria and placed significant weight on that. Kind of going back to last year's competition, we had discussions about a lot of projects that had problems fully expending their funds. So we're trying to prevent consistently leaving money on the table and making sure that we're serving as many people as possible. In terms of performance, the highest weight that was placed by those with lived expertise was on the ability for a program to quickly move persons into housing and to exit them to permanent housing upon their time in a program coming to an end. So we placed a slightly higher point value on the length of time between entry and housing move-in. And we also placed a higher weight on permanent housing exits. Other changes that we would have made, we also moved bed and unit utilization from a threshold to being a scoring criteria, since that was another area that we were seeing some concerns with beds and units going underutilized. We also increased the weight to the income measures. Last year, they were 2.5 points apiece. This year, they'll be 5 points apiece. And we also tried to make across the board things to be easy values for us to be able to assign partial credit on items. Some items last year, we had too small of point values and it became really difficult for us to assign any kind of partial values. We had to make it all or nothing. So this year we tried to, like, if possible, make things 10 points, 20 points, very rounded numbers that if somebody didn't meet a measure, we could still average something and assign a percentage of the points to them. Do you recall any other significant changes?
I think that you covered most of the ones, and the ones that folks with lived experiences explicitly stated as being important to them. Thank you.
Other discussion points? Yeah.
I know that there was conversations in the past, I'm just kind of curious where it lands. So in domestic violence world, sometimes that homeless experience looks a little bit different. Sometimes they're coming actually from house spaces. That house is no longer tenable. They're then needing to come into emergency shelter or with friends or family and then get in. And then there's that separation period of just sort of separating from this abusive partner. So I know sometimes we're a lower score on time where application is submitted to actually moving into housing, because there just is some of that other work that has to go on. So I didn't know if this score, it feels like we've talked about this lots, but is there some compassion, Jeff? I'm looking for compassion. Is there some help with that? Because I think we always feel a little bit of a disappointment in the length of time that it takes.
Yeah, so we actually utilized similar measures for general projects and DV projects, but we did hear concerns across the board, not just with our DV providers, regarding the tough rental market and the ability to transition people quickly into housing. So for example, for rapid rehousing projects, we did increase the measure from 30 days between enrollment and move-in to 45 days. And then for PSH projects, it's going to remain at 60 days. So we tried to give a little bit more leeway while still keeping in mind that the most important thing to those that we serve is that ability for quick move-ins. So we tried to find a way to balance those.
So we bumped it up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So that will mean that the partnership that you all have, you'll be judged a little bit more compassionately this year.
Thank you.
Any other discussion from the board?
I have a process question. Given that we're, in the process of designing more ways that we're engaging people with lived experience, do you have any lessons or reflections from doing it this time around that we should apply in the future?
So we definitely would love more time, and unfortunately, we just pulled that work group together, and we didn't have a lot of time to move. We had to go ahead and secure a space and try to communicate to folks that we were doing this. We did obtain some gift cards with COC planning dollars that we could use as an incentive so that we would be able to use this as a trial run to see how that might go for future events that we would hold. Surveys are not the easiest strategy to obtain this information. There was a lot of trying to explain things on the front end, trying to answer questions and help persons that might have varying abilities while they completed surveys. So we wouldn't opt to go that way necessarily for every opportunity that we have in the future. We would hope to be able to hold some more focus group type format meetings. We just found that due to the timeline that we had and also trying to quantify and make things objective criteria, that survey research lended itself very easily to us being able to take those survey results and then adjust the scoring tool in relation. So that's one lesson that would be learned. The other thing is just that we definitely think we're on the right track in establishing that work group, because then next year's competition will already have a work group that will ideally consist of numerous people with lived expertise that we can tap into without having to try to go out and pursue events where we don't necessarily already have that base for input already established. Anything else? If not, then I would need a motion for approval.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second. You do it, you do it.
All right. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? And Bruce, I saw your hand, but, all right. The motion would pass. Thank you so much. And Bruce, I know that you adjusted your schedule today to help us out. This would be the portion that we needed the quorum for, so you do not have to feel obligated to stay for the Data and Systems Integration Committee. I really appreciate it.
He gets a treat.
All right.
Yes.
So our next regular meeting is going to be September 13th. Again, that will be when we will approve the collaborative application as well as the priority listing. So we really need the help of our board to make that happen. At this time, is there any other issues or public sharing for items not on the agenda?
Jeff, I gotta go too.
I understand. Thank you for making it a priority to be here. Really, really, really appreciate it. All right, we'll go ahead and adjourn the special COC meeting at 1:28 p.m. And now, if board members or anybody else would like to relocate themselves, you have an opportunity.
Also, if you are here for our special board meeting, please sign the attendance sheet that was over there. I have a second attendance sheet for data and systems integration, so I will pass that along. And that will also include one up here too. Thank you all.
All right, so now we will go ahead and call to order the Data and Systems Integration Committee meeting. It is 1:29 p.m. And since this is a committee meeting, we will do a full round of introductions for all members. I am Jeff Heron. I'm the manager of LFUCG's Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
I'm Bo Revlett. I'm HPI board.
I'm Diane Fleet, Associate Director, Greenhouse 17, which is a domestic violence program for Central Kentucky.
Joy Andrade, member of the HPI board.
Am I a member? Ryan Vedder from Independence Place.
Mayor O'Donnell, Salvation Army, Veterans Affairs Services.
Marty Jones from the Action Film.
I'm Allison Hoffman, housing coordinator at Greenhouse 17. Caitlin Dixon in LFUCG's Office of Housing Advocacy and Community Development.
David Shab with the Hope Center.
Christina Ellison with New Beginnings Bluegrass.
Dylan Shell with New Vista.
Jackie Long, Mountain Comprehensive Care.
Mackenzie Willoughby, Mount Comprehensive Care. Liz Sheehan, board member and council member.
Marissa Webb, I'm in the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
Aaron Golden Sherry, Recovery Cafe, Lexington, and Kate's Place.
Thank you, everybody. I can turn this over to you. This is your committee. If you want, you can facilitate.
Sure.
All right, so it looks like on the agenda, approval of minutes from the June 7th meeting. Is there any discussion, any questions, corrections?
If not, this would be a full membership vote, and we would need a motion from the membership.
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, the motion passes.
Wonderful. All right, so our next agenda item is new business. And it looks like we are doing the system performance measure analysis.
Yeah. Do you have this article? I'm sorry. If not, I have a Word version on my hard drive. All right. So we had already given you some preliminary information about the system performance measure submission that we submitted in February or so at our last meeting. But after that, there was a tool released by HUD that gave some data. They had a Tableau dashboard that had data from communities of care across the entire country, and it allows us not only to see some of the trends year to year for our local performance measures, but also it allowed us to take a look at where we would compare with some national averages. I thought that might be helpful to put some of this into context, because a lot of times when we discuss system performance measures, we're really viewing it through the lens of, from last year, we went up or we went down, or we might view it in the context of, we're going to lose some points in the COC application this year because we didn't hit this measure. This, I think, is a little bit more helpful in giving us context in terms of how we're truly performing. So we prepared some information around each of these measures. So measure 1 is the length of time that persons remain homeless, and these national averages specifically were available for the length of time that individuals remain in emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing. Of course, we would not have any safe haven programs or units, so we'd be talking solely about emergency shelter and transitional housing. So that also includes some information about how we are assessed within our COC application. In order for us to obtain the maximum amount of points possible between fiscal year 21 and 22, HUD would like to see that we have reduced the average length of time individuals and families remain homeless by at least 5 percentage points, or that the COC's average length of time that individuals were homeless was 90 days or less. So first, just comparing our performance to the national average, individuals on average remain homeless in ES or TH about 51 days within Lexington, and the national average was 158 days. So that means that on this measure, we actually exceeded the national average quite significantly. And then looking at our performance compared to the previous year, we only managed to reduce the amount by 3 days. However, that is just over 5%, and the length of time is under 90 days, so we are likely going to receive the full points in that section of our application. The other thing that we're going to try to engage in after this is some discussion around ideals for additional strategies that we can pursue for each measure. When we report out in our application on this performance, we also have the ability to obtain some points just from presenting our formal strategies that we have for each measure. And I would like us to increasingly talk about that more within this committee. We'll get there in a minute, but just keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to these measures and think about how we might improve them further. Moving on to measure 2, this is the extent to which persons return to homelessness within 6 months. On the COC application, HUD is looking that from last year to this year, we would have reduced the rate at which persons who exited to permanent housing destinations experience additional episodes of homelessness within 6 months by at least 1 percentage point, or that the rate was 5% or less. So first, comparing to the national average, within the 6-month mark, we actually performed better than the national average. Nationally, 7.3% of persons returned to homelessness within 6 months, and within Lexington, it was 6.1%. So we were a little over 1% under that national average, and we actually performed better than we did in the previous year's submission, managing to reduce that percentage by almost 3 percentage points. So at the 6-month mark, things are good. This measure includes some other points that we would assess at, including the 12 and the 24-month marks. When looking at those that return within 12 months, again, HUD is seeking that we would reduce that by 1 percentage point, or that the overall rate of return was 10% or less. So Lexington, within 12 months, saw 11.6% of persons that initially successfully exited to permanent housing then return to homelessness, and the national average was only 11.0%. So this is where things start to go left. We do a really good job of preparing people to initially leave our programs and establish permanent housing of their own, but somewhere around the 1-year mark is where they start to have some struggles. Compared to last year, we did manage to reduce this number pretty significantly. Again, 2.5% decrease over last year. But then when we look at the 24-month mark, we see that we get further out of line with national performance. So this is not used as a scoring criteria under the COC competition. HUD typically only assesses on the 6 and 12-month marks. However, we do assess data and submit data for the 24-month mark and still have the ability to compare to the national average, and we were 8.1% over the national average for returns within 24 months. So again, I really think the area that we need to focus on is that 1 to 2 year mark. That seems to be the point at which we go off course and where things really start to get difficult for our former participants to maintain housing. This also was not great for us in terms of comparisons to last year's submission. We also had nearly a 1% increase in just comparisons between our 21 and 22 data.
Is that because of the huge increases in rents, though?
I mean, it's definitely something that we have to keep in mind. So this would have been data that would have been through, was it September 30th?
Yeah.
Of 22. So when we're talking about the 2 years prior, you are looking at persons who exited like roughly pre-pandemic, and then through the majority of the pandemic is where we're going to see that they returned. So that's definitely something that we have to consider. It might not solely be a reflection of our performance. It's going to include things like loss of income. It's going to include things like difficulties with the rental market and affordable housing. There's going to be several different factors that are going to tie in there. But we also, since we don't have hard data on it that's collected and assessed, we can't say with confidence that it is solely or primarily a factor of those larger trends. Some of it could still be a true performance issue. Given that we still would have been above the national average at 24 months for the previous year, I think that we need to assume that at least part of this is on us. Measure 3 is a change in annual counts. This one is going to be not an area that we pick up points on our application this year. So just comparing our pit counts, again, there's going to be no national average here. HUD would be looking that we would have a 5 percentage point decrease in the total number of persons that are experiencing homelessness, and they would also look at our sheltered and unsheltered numbers. All three, sheltered, unsheltered, and total, went up for us between 22 and 23. We have talked about the fact that 22, that count may have undercounted persons slightly due to the COVID precautions that were in place. And then we're getting back into factors like the rising rents. And so that means that a lot of persons who are not in our system previously throughout the past 2 to 3 years have experienced episodes of homelessness, and many of them are still experiencing episodes of homelessness. That's why we also have some information, not just around one day out of the year, but looking at our annual HMIS counts. We also had an increase of about 986 persons that were served within HMIS throughout the calendar year. The HUD fiscal year, so October 1 of 21 through September 30th of 22. And that would be nearly a 40% increase. I definitely would have anticipated that we were going to have some level of increase there. A little alarmed at the number.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you say there's no national average, I understand not having an average for like the number of people, because that's going to differ across communities and all that. But is there any way to compare the percentage of increase across communities or for the nation?
So HUD's tool that specifically gave us this data did not include that. It just literally said there was no average available. We are now starting to get some information out of other sources that talk about the increases that other communities are experiencing. We got some things email blast over the last couple of weeks that demonstrate that. And we are seeing that a lot of cities, especially larger cities, are seeing increases somewhere between 20 and 30% from 22 to 23. And also, you know, there are some communities now that have unsheltered populations. Boston's unsheltered population is something like 45,000 individuals. So from other sources, we do have a little bit of data. We just don't have as much robust data as is packaged within this tool that literally includes every continuum. But I think within the next couple of months, we will have the ability to better assess that as we start to see a lot more of that published in other places.
It sounds like you're on like an email list or something, so you get these emails across the community, but are there any groups where you have kind of like a regional, I don't know, conference or something where you get to talk with people who are like the benchmark cities that we compare against for other metrics?
HUD does have some regional meetings and technical assistance sessions. They're not necessarily, it's all going to be grouped just geographically, not necessarily by peer communities. We have not had the capacity to really seek out the ability to construct that ourselves, but it is something that I think moving forward would be helpful. For example, I know you were part of the committee that we looked at peer communities and their winter weather responses. So those might be some of the communities that we might start to reach out to and try to develop some relationships in hopes that maybe we can independently bring some of that together.
Thank you.
Jeff, I had a question too.
Yeah.
The HMIS count, is that people on coordinated entry, people who are indicated as experiencing homelessness in HMIS, or just total HMIS numbers within our CLC?
So it's going to be the programs that would be included the way that HUD defines system performance measures. So it's going to be emergency shelter and street outreach, and it's going to be actually street outreach is only in certain measures. I'm gonna say, for this measure, I'd have to do further research to definitively say if it includes street outreach, but I know emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. System performance measures, for some reason, do not look at coordinated entry data at all. My instinct there is that some communities don't have great coordinated entry data, and where we've seen introduction of a lot of different coordinated entry data fields within HMIS data standards, and they're trying to tinker with that now and make it a little bit better, a little bit more user-friendly, more intuitive. They're trying to collapse some of those fields into one field to make data completeness better. I think that in coming years, we will see the inclusion of coordinated entry data as well. But right now, it's just going to reflect other continuum projects. But it would not include things like supportive service only programs or programs that voluntarily would participate but are not required to participate.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Looking at measure 4, this is going to be another area where there's going to be a few different measures. We focused on the increase in income for system leavers. That is how we are scored on our continuum of care application. HUD is seeking that we would have for our leavers an increase in employment income at least 20% or higher, or that, I don't think I have a percentage there. I'm not sure. I have to double check that. Not sure if that's a typo on my part. No, it's correct. It's just a flat increase in percentage. So there's not a certain percentage point increase that we have to achieve, just that we do have an increase in the amount, or that the overall amount is 20% or higher. So in Lexington, we actually did better. We always talk about how badly we do on this measure. We actually didn't do terrible on it this year. We had 21.1% of system leavers increasing their employment income, and the national average was only 14.2%. So we were nearly 7% above the national average. And compared to last year, we had a pretty significant increase of about 10%. And I'm sure you've probably caught on by now, but I color-coded all of these arrows. If it's green, that was positive, it means we're moving in the right direction. If it's red, that means we're not doing so hot. Looking at non-employment cash income for leavers, there's not a national average for this measure, so we just looked locally. HUD is going to assess the continuum on whether we had an increase in the percentage or if the overall percentage was 50% or higher. We had 18%, which was a 1% increase, but we're not exactly where we need to be. Keep in mind that for this measure in particular, they're only looking at participants from a continuum of care funded project. So this wouldn't include things like an ESG rapid rehousing program, only those that are funded through the continuum of care program. And a lot of these individuals are going to be persons that are probably already coming to us with things like SSI, SSDI benefits if they're available to them. So I do understand that we have some limited capacity, but I think this is an area that we could definitely improve performance. Measure 5 is going to pertain to the number of persons who become homeless for the first time. Again, no national average for this. What HUD is looking for is that from last year to this, that we would have reduced the number of persons that became homeless for the first time. Obviously, we did not. So we looked at the number of persons that presented within our emergency shelter and transitional housing programs between fiscal years 21 and 22. That was almost a 50% increase. And then we also looked at the number of persons, in addition to emergency shelter and transitional housing, that would have entered a permanent housing program with no prior enrollments. and that was just over 40% increase from fiscal year 21 to 22. Again, this kind of goes back to things like our annual counts and the point in time count and an HMIS. We definitely anticipated that there would be an increase. These numbers are a little disappointing. Measure 6 does not pertain to our community because we do not have any programs that meet that measure. So we'll move on to Measure 7, successful exits to permanent housing. Specifically, we're going to zero in on exits from emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing. In this area, we are being assessed by trying to establish that we have increased the successful exits by at least 2 percentage points, or that the overall rate of exits to permanent housing was 50% or higher. Unfortunately, we will lose these points on our application. In terms of the national average, that was 33.9% successful permanent housing exits, and we had a 12.3% success rate. So over 20% gap between us and the national average. And then our performance also decreased from 21 to 22 with approximately 1 percentage point difference. We also broke out the measure for permanent housing. It's going to be a little bit different in the sense that that measure specifies that individuals would retain their permanent housing. So for example, if they remain a participant in the program, or if they exit to permanent housing. The measure from HUD is that we would improve by 1 percentage point, or that the overall rate of retention and successful exits would be 96% or higher. Our rate was 94.2%, and the national average was 96.2%. So we're about 2% lower than where we need to be. And we also decreased in this area from the previous year, just over 3 percentage points. So this is another area that we will lose some points on performance measures. This, again, is another area that I think speaks in tandem with the information that we saw regarding returns to homelessness. I think that it illustrates that we have a lot more work that can be done to successfully prepare individuals for transitions from program assistance to self-sufficiency.
I think our revised common assessment tool will help those numbers too. I think a lot of the rapid rehousing returns, a lot of people were assessed for rapid rehousing before that really should have been permanent supportive housing, and that's kind of skewed numbers. I think that we'll see improvements by the way we're assessing people now, and the finding list.
We can hope. I will say that there's been an extensive cleanup of the list, and I do think that our common assessment tool is making some improvements. I think some of this too is going to have to come from coordinated strategies to do things like increase income, both employment and non-employment. Also probably looking at things like what are we doing to teach tenancy? What life skills are we managing to teach? It seems like folks are doing okay when they have the safety net. It's when that safety net is removed, we're somehow not giving the tools for people to be able to successfully navigate challenges that come back up. And I'm sure another thing we need to consider is that if somebody who had exited from a program and was trying to seek rental assistance last year, it would have been an incredibly challenging time to locate rental assistance. Short of a program like Housing Stabilization Program, every other program that we typically had prior to the pandemic had exhausted funds as soon as funding became available due to the level of community need. So again, I think this speaks to also a need for additional prevention funding. Maybe some of these households could have performed better in the area of retaining their housing if there was a little bit of funding that was available when they hit a roadblock.
Does this include veterans?
So it does include veterans programs that would participate in HMIS. So it would include the rapid rehousing component of SSVF, as well as things like the HUD-VASH program and our transitional veterans GPD programs. Questions or conversation? I think this is something that we are really wanting to make this more accessible. We talk about data a lot in this meeting. Obviously, it's part of the name, but we want to make data accessible. We don't want it to be something that people are closed off from or don't understand. That's why we tried to streamline this presentation with clear numbers, color coding, things that hopefully directionality, give you a clear sense of how we're performing and where we need to go.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the exits for the measured prior, so those in shelter, transitional, et cetera, do we have data on which were the most common exits? Was it mostly unknown, cannot locate, I imagine, for that?
So we can take a deeper dive into that and look further, but I will say when it comes to shelter, the number one thing that hurts us is going to be just overall lack of destination data. We have a much higher destination data completion rate when it comes to other forms of programs, but I will say that the actual challenges in performance were not solely for emergency shelter. We did see that there was some declines in other programming as well, but we can give some more detailed follow-up information as we continue these conversations in future meetings. We'll definitely make a note of that and be sure to provide some additional context.
Yeah, thank you, because I think that especially, and those figures too for even the permanent housing retention might be good to help us target our strategy for the after-action review for those that return to homelessness.
We can look into both the data error rates and the breakdown of those individual projects.
I think the numbers of first-time homelessness and also just the general number increase in those that are experiencing homelessness sort of match anecdotally at least what we had been feeling, and now with active data to support that, it's like, okay, yeah, we're not just crazy. It is really a real thing, but I also think that points to a bigger like an issue that is bigger than just the COC providers in the room.
I think that's a state problem.
A lot of changes that have occurred, especially with what we have been seeing, a lot of non-renewals and things like that.
Yeah,
That-
there's the CSC and what we do.
Right.
There's local, there's state, there's federal, and right now we have problems across the board that if better addressed would impact those measures. I firmly agree with
I
that.
did intakes for like 4 hours one day this week, and I had 3 people who come in to the shelter because their leases were renewed, like in 4 hours. Like, it's just insane. That's just like all the rage right now.
We had someone came last week who was in a mobile home and their lease was reduced. And somebody bought the mobile home park and that was her.
So I want us to kind of start thinking about those different anecdotes. And I know we may not have all of the work done today, but to frame a conversation for today and for the future. It's on this side. Of course. Wanted to start some discussion around our formal strategies. Oftentimes we kind of try to, within our application, speak to the work that we are aware that we're doing, but I think as a continuum, we probably need to develop those strategies together and discuss them routinely. And we want that to live here within this committee. Oftentimes I get questions about what committees people should attend or what would be most helpful to them, what makes the most sense for them. And just kind of wanted to make a roadmap, and I'm seeing that it's actually much smaller up there, so I will kind of focus and move around. So first, this is where we are today. We're in data and systems integration. And this is a committee that I know has gone through a lot of changes over several years now and has kind of struggled to find its identity and its voice. And so really what we would like to focus on is first, evaluating data and systems. So that means that we want to take things that we have at our disposal, like our HMIS data, but we also seek to try to attract partners that are operating within other systems that might bring their own data and expertise. And then this is going to be the landing pad where we would work to develop strategies that we think will ultimately lead towards performance. That is going to be improved both within the COC, but also better integration of those different systems. Then we would hope that those strategies can be taken by our Advocacy, Issues, and Programs Committee, that they can do the work of trying to compare their different policy agendas and work to educate the public, stakeholders, and our elected officials as we identify the things that we feel are important. For example, we're having these discussions about this is bigger than just the COC. There are things at the local, state, federal level that also impact these measures. So how do we take that and reach the people that we need to get them on board and help us to execute our vision? Then hopefully that will lead to us having discussions within advocacy around the programs that we want to develop, where we want to prioritize the funding and resources that we have available. And our Program Performance and Evaluation Committee will decide where that funding ultimately gets awarded to and help us to evaluate the performance of individual programs. But that committee will also have the dual goal of looking at performance level data for programs and identifying what things are bigger than an individual program. We have a lot of discussions within that committee that I think are helpful in identifying whether something might be tied to something like a population that's served, or maybe if there was a gap in staffing. But we also come across a lot of different things as we have those conversations that indicate broader system trends. And I want us to formally take that information and then funnel that back into this committee so that we can run the data, analyze it at a deeper level to make sure it's not just an anecdote, that it's actually something that we're seeing in data, and keep that cycle moving to continuously have conversations that look at both the system and program levels and outreach to the individuals that we need to be a part of the conversation. So going back to our performance measures, I'll open the floor today for just some initial conversation around formalizing our strategies. I know that we're not going to have all the answers today, but if we can go ahead and talk about some of the challenges and some of the potential solutions, I think we can hand some recommendations over to the Advocacy Committee for further development of policies and programming. So starting with measure 1 and the length of time that individuals would remain homeless, I think a lot of this is going to be drawn from our frontline staff that would be coming from our street outreach providers, our emergency shelter providers, and even our transitional housing providers. Anybody have anything that they would like to share in terms of common challenges that they are seeing with the individuals that they're working with? I think that might be a good place for us to start. I know we have several of our frontline agencies here in the room.
I mean, well, I just mentioned the people not renewing leases. That seems to be a big thing lately. But I think one of the big obstacles with housing is the lack of income. Or, you know, I mean, we have people, I get it, I totally get it. We want to be housing first and not discriminate if people don't have income and help them get into housing, but they're not going to stay in housing if they don't have income. Like, we know that, we do it anyway. So that's a problem. And you can't just say, like, you can't just cut those people out, but we have to find a way to help them get income. You can say, oh, SOAR, but that's not always, they don't always qualify. So,
And let's face it, even if we're successful in obtaining SSI, SSDI benefits, it helps.
Yeah.
But they're still probably going to be reliant on an income-based housing property, a voucher, a subsidy. There's very few landlords that are going to have income requirements that are going to say, oh, you have $900 a month? Come on in.
And then add to that the backgrounds. There's very little housing available for people who can't pass a background check.
I was going to say, on the point of income, our attempt at the transition in place program, we found that, for example, a lot of the folks that we were initially targeting that had pets and other shelter barriers, that model was to transition people 3 to 6 months to holding a lease with their own name. And most of those individuals had high acuities, low or no income, and very little ability to quickly establish enough income to be able to transition that lease into their own name.
And didn't want to participate in services to do it. So when you, as many times as you would say, you're going to be out of this program in 3 to 6 months, it never resonated.
These are kind of quirky things. I don't know that it necessarily fits, because I do think our population sometimes is a little bit different. But one thing, well, when you're just talking about fee, application fees are crazy pants. So that's a problem. It used to be like $20, $30. Now they're $150. I think we paid one for $150. Yeah, $150. So that's an issue when people are living in shelter and we're trying to help with those pieces. So somebody wants to apply to 5 or 6 apartments. There's like almost $1,000 for
and
spending.
they'll take it even if they know they're not.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good.
So that's a big issue. With us, it's also a little bit of a problem is this is probably for another day, but we're almost kind of forcing people to become homeless to get funding, where, like, I'm sort of thinking a little bit, like, I'd like to kind of classify homes where there's violence in the home as uninhabitable, and they're already, you know what I mean, like, it's already uninhabitable, therefore it is not a place of good condition. Because what we're doing is we're moving them from a home, bringing them to shelter, so that they're then available to apply for funding, because at the moment they're still considered housed, you know, so that seems to always be a little bit of an issue. And then the other thing that I think we sort of think of our program as being about 4 or 5 months. So we're kind of pushing against this goal of 2 months, because we're sort of hoping people stay with us 3 or 4 months to sort of settle down. But I think that makes us skew numbers. Now, I know we're a small pot, you know, so I know certainly Salvation Army and Hope Center and stuff will skew it the other way, but we're trending against you all already.
I think these are all really helpful. You had started with the application fees, and I don't know if maybe Caitlin or Marissa would want to give an update on what LFUCG is doing to address that. Okay. Sorry to put you all on the spot.
Tell us.
I know that they are in the process of creating a program. I know Danielle Sanders at Community Resident Services kind of heading that up, because they're planning on running it out of Community Resident Services. So I don't know how far along they are, how close they are, but they are in the process, because that's something that I realized too and brought to them, because like you guys said, application fees are just extremely high and applying to multiple, it racks up. So there is a program that is being created for that. Like I said, I don't know when it will be running.
And is that to help with funding, or that there's one universal one that would work at multiple places?
It's to help fund
It
those
fund it.
fees. We know that there's a lot of sources that do not allow the use of funds towards things like application fees. So this would be tapping into some other grant funds that we would be able to use. And I think the program's gonna be structured for either 3 application fees or the maximum amount of,
I believe it's the maximum amount of $300. So it's whichever one comes first. So this would be 3, and this would be per individual too, because we know sometimes when a application fee will be for each adult in the household. So then if you have 2 adults in the household, you're having to pay application fees for both. This would be pertaining to cover application fees per person rather than just per household.
That would be really helpful. It would be interesting, though, when I first heard you say it, is if their landlords would agree, I don't know if they make money off this, I don't know, but if there was a universal background check piece that would fit for multiple apartments. So you just had to do it once, but you could take that to multiple places.
Yeah, I know that was not within our discussion, and I think part of it too is because landlords will do their background check kind of however they please, you know, especially when it comes to things like credit checks too. They'll vary very widely in that. So I can certainly bring that to those meetings and ask. But I know this would be a way to help alleviate some of those costs
Nice.
where, like as Jeff said, the other programs would not be able to cover the application fees, but could cover some of the initial move-in costs as well. And just to piggyback on what Caitlin said, I believe at our last meeting, the individual who was heading up that project stated that he would be meeting with Danielle that week, this was last week, to discuss the interface of exactly how that application would look. So to my knowledge, it is near the final stages, but not necessarily ready to go quite yet.
It's exciting.
but we definitely want to let you know it's on the horizon. We see the need, we're working towards it. I don't need this anymore.
I do.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I didn't realize. Also, I think that your ideal is a great one. I'm not sure what the response from landlords is going to be, but I know the Department of Housing Advocacy and Community Development is also working on development of a landlord roundtable. So that would be a platform that we could take ideals that we have and generate some feedback to try to test or float some of those ideals.
So, I mean, I'm hopeful this comment isn't completely unhelpful, but I think, you know, one of the things that we're seeing is that some of these things are such a large systemic problem that they fall outside of the COC to correct, even with pretty intensive measures or funding options, because the key issue is that landlords as owners of the property have far too much right to just assign value to whatever thing they want, create their own rules, while they're using our valuable space, our city, as their means to generate their income. So they're not really, like for example, a restaurant has to adhere to certain standards to be able to operate. Landlords really have very minimal standards by comparison. And we're operating in a system where people can have their leases not renewed for no apparent reason, right? With virtually no notice.
We don't have a cap on how much rent can be increased.
Exactly, that's another thing. And the requirement for income of a certain amount, the requirement for background checks with very unclear standards for what will and will not be accepted before you apply, because let's be honest, the application is additional income. That's what they're using it for, predominantly.
I was listening to a podcast totally unrelated to homelessness, but they were expressing that they were going and applying for places. They're getting no follow-up whatsoever on their application, and they know that the checks weren't even necessarily being run at times because of the how quick sometimes the response would come back. And basically that it's just another source of income for a lot of landlords that maybe have no intent of ever leasing that property. I guess there's now a lot of communities are also seeing places advertising on websites like Zillow and charging application fees before someone can even see the property. They have to pay the application fee to book a viewing. And then they're getting denied before that viewing occurs.
And that's really like, again, that's why it does kind of fall outside of what we can actually achieve within our own funding, right? Like obviously we can advocate.
I'm gonna shoot for the moon, and you
Yeah.
know what? If it's a no, it's a no, but we can take that idea, we can go back to, I can go back to my commissioner, we can go to the council, we can present ideals, and the worst thing that can happen is people say no. And I know you understand this because the tenants group is putting together their full wish list and seeing what can be actually adopted.
Yeah, and well, on this note, one curiosity that I had for the providers in the room was like in 2022, this group, and well, especially PPE is where I remember it happening a lot, talked a lot about landlords rejecting vouchers. And I wonder if like people still see that as a big problem.
Yes.
Still, and gives them.
Either that or FMR is too low for properties in areas that's more common for my programming in rural areas, but it's still a thing here.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, because ban on source of income discrimination has been before committee for months. Dave Savigny referred it months ago, and it just like hasn't come up. And I know that like we sent a letter as a COC around this time last year. I think it was October of last year, but I think it may be interesting for us to discuss like what it would mean for the COC to follow up with like, you know, some more reasoning behind why like this would be a meaningful thing for the
It was
people in this
I
room.
had an interesting conversation, but this was in Winchester, so Clark County, so I'm just being full exposure, but we were looking for a person that was out back, and she had a mainstream voucher. Mainstream voucher. We're looking for a place in Clark County for her to go. I probably called 20 landlords, she probably called 10, none of them would take a voucher. No. I was startled with it because I hadn't gone through that process to the degree that it was. But I did get this one guy calling you back. You can take it or leave it and just say he was BS. I don't know. There was something about him. He goes, I just wanted to make sure that you know, I really would be happy to rent to this lovely person, who's not really lovely, but this lovely person that wants to move in. She goes, but he said, I'm really struggling with the inspectors. He goes, you have these kind of housing inspector with a clipboard, and they come through and they tell me things that I have to do. And he said, and I would fix it. He said, but I can't like paint my house in the winter. I have to wait till whatever. Or the one window was a little sticky and I couldn't do it. He goes, I found it impossible to please the inspectors. He goes, and I didn't feel they had housing acumen or, you know, building acumen around them. They were kind of social work folks. It was probably my people, the clipboard going, you got to fix this. So I don't know, I found it interesting, but it was a shift for me because I was getting bitter about folks who were not renting. And I think there are some landlords that need inspection and all that stuff. I just put it out there that it was a different lens that I was coming at. And he made a very big point to call me to say, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. So I'm just going to take it at that.
A couple of thoughts. One thing is specifically related to inspection requirements. You mentioned sometimes social work staff doing it. A lot of agencies, we do complete our own assessments, and I think that's meant to make the process quicker and easier. But I can understand that we may have some folks that maybe don't have as much expertise. I can definitely talk with Director Reynolds to see if there's any possibility of grants being able to expand the inspections that they're doing. They presently would do things for like our home programs, for example. We could look to see if there might be a possibility of increasing their ability to do those inspections, because those are code enforcement officers. Those are individuals that do have a little bit more advanced training.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned FMR, so I was just going to say the positive and negative news around FMR, we do anticipate an FMR increase. However, the downside being, we've heard that because of how much rents have gone up and how much they'll have to raise FMR, we can anticipate that probably about 50% of Tier 2 projects across the country are going to receive full funding. So,
Not receive any funding.
yeah. So there's probably going to be some challenges.
And I just want to point, like Bo, what you're talking about, of, yes, it's still an issue with vouchers, of places not accepting vouchers, but we have also seen a lot of properties too that raise their rent $10, $15 above FMR. And we'll take vouchers, we'll take anybody, but won't be willing to come down any on the rent to accommodate that. And so that's the loophole they're using.
Yeah, and just in response to what you all both said, so Louisville passed the Balanced Source of Income Discrimination and has implemented stuff to address specifically those things. Like they added language to their ordinance saying that like landlords weren't allowed to do that, and if they can prove that like they were doing that to get around vouchers, then that they would be prosecutable. And then like the housing authority designed a program to like make it easier, like to basically cut some corners on inspections, I think, if people would accept vouchers. And so like there are like ways to do policy design to get around that, but also at the end of the day, landlords are going to do what they're going to do. So like you can't accommodate all the way.
That's it. There's not a lot of teeth to that because you have to prove that, and that requires a lot of resources that you don't actually have.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth pursuing because at least it's that threat that we know what you're doing.
And there is like, there's data that at aggregate level, even when there's low enforcement, voucher utilization rates skyrocket and level of, and rate of denial just goes way down, even whenever there's low enforcement.
So one of the biggest things that I encounter when they talk about not wanting to take vouchers is the damages to the apartments. Because we can only, with a voucher, we can only pay like an extra month's rent for damages, or in the form of security deposit. So they're saying the damages, far exceed, and they do sometimes. I mean, it's a population that is hard on an apartment and sometimes intentionally. And so that is the biggest thing, is not being able to pay $1,000, $2,000 worth of damages when they move out, and then they just say it's not worth it and they won't take vouchers anymore.
So that's something that we would, I think, need to look at collect and examine some data on, because we had some discussions as a community about 4 years ago around creation of a mitigation fund for things like damages. And Polly and I worked to contact individual providers and go back and look at over the previous 2 years, whatever time frame, instances in which they actually had damages that exceeded what they were able to pay on their funding source. And there was actually at that time very little data that demonstrated that there was a need, and so ultimately advocacy issues and programs did not recommend that for an area of funding.
I think that they assume that there's going to be a lot of damages, and so I found like if we're able to say, we can pay you, so like with the ESG COVID flexibilities, we were able to offer incentives, for instance. And when you say, okay, well, we can pay you this much in incentive, or, just when you can say, we'll be able to pay maybe not all of it, but some more towards the damages if they happen, then they're more willing, they feel like they're taken care of. When I went to talk to the Downtown Landlord Association, that was the number one thing that they talked about was damages to their apartments.
Yeah, and I totally get it, because I hear that one too. That's why we did that discussion, because I remember that pretty in depth, and all of the data, not just locally, everything that I was able to find in preparing the request to kind of move forward with that, supported that fundamentally that is just a discriminatory attitude. There is absolutely no data to support that our population is more likely to damage a unit. If anything, they may be slightly less likely to damage a unit than any random person renting because of the supportive services. Now, when they happen, can they sometimes be expensive? Yeah, sometimes, but that can happen with anybody.
Few and far between, but maybe sometimes very extensive or significant.
when it happens, then they don't want to deal with anyone else. That's
Yeah.
the problem. So then it probably doesn't happen very often, but if you can tell someone that there is an ability to help them with the damages, because you can't require services, so if you can't make someone participate, so you can't say, oh, they're getting services, because I've had landlords say, well, they're not getting, where's the services? Because they're clearly, it's not working. It's because you can't force them to participate. So I think it's more of a psychological thing with landlords. If they feel like they're being taken care of and they're being considered in it, then they're more likely to take a chance and participate.
It's helpful. There's a couple different strategies I can think of that we might be able to pursue. We could also pursue, if we do have any data that demonstrates that it's not something that we're seeing, messaging that data back to landlords to help assuage their concerns. But also maybe just having the fund just as appearances.
Exactly.
And I was, maybe it could be, so like our program is able to pay, we're not capped at damages. And so when we have been approaching new properties of saying, practically the only difference is you're gonna receive payment from us. Like, it's no different, we will cover anything. We have paid $5,000, $6,000 in damages on a unit. But it's still, I think, just overall of if everybody's not able to provide that sort of
Right.
security, they're not willing to. So if we could have something in place where it was across the board, because instead it could be like, oh, well, Jackie's person tore the place all to hell, and
That's
so I'm not
exactly
working with
right.
anybody ever again. When I'm like, here's a big check, please take the money.
So this has been incredibly helpful to us. And just looking at the clock, I know that we have some other agenda items. So on other performance measures like returns, like income, permanent housing exits and retention, would there be other thoughts that we want to go ahead and put on the table? I want to make sure we leave at least 20, 25 minutes for the other agenda items.
I mean, for returns to homelessness, we've had some initial discussions.
Yes.
So I think that one, myself, and obviously feel free to chime in if people disagree. But I think that if we just kind of formalize our language around how we want to implement that, that could address a significant portion of that particular plan. And then with the income component, I think that while, David kind of touched on this with the SOAR piece, while that's really nice and can help, and I know has helped people in our programming and other programming, earned income especially is an area that's difficult. And, we've had success with utilizing supported employment programming through our agency, IPS specifically. But that's only usable for certain populations. So I think that it could be wise to either set aside dollars or a push towards some form of supported employment as a city, whether that be through a provider or whatever. But I think that if we had a place to direct people, and it could even be billable through OVR if they set up something like IPS to kind of generate some of the money back for the cost of the position, that could help significantly in serving our clientele, especially if we could figure out a way to have some slots that didn't require some of the conditions that would be required for something like IPS, which would be a serious mental illness diagnosis.
I think too that we have in the continuum members that focus on employment, but sometimes they're not the persons that are consistently here at our meetings. And I think maybe we can break out some subcommittees within this conversation on strategies, and maybe if we can increase the attractiveness of our meetings to certain members, that maybe we can have some very specialized conversations, because some of this should already exist. These are what programs like vocational rehabilitation, OWL, that's the kind of stuff that these organizations are already doing. We just have to figure out how to better connect it with the population that we serve.
Yeah.
Other thoughts around strategies?
I think like one of the things that we struggle with, and a lot of this is on us because of the volume, right? Like we have a lot more people, so if we can figure out something that draws that percentage up. But we've had a hard time historically getting people to report income to us. Like we don't know where they go during the day, they're just not there. And so like you'll find out on the back end that they've been working or they're bringing in income. And they just, for whatever reason, keep that secret. Like we're not charging rent anymore, just trying to entice people to, not charging the $1 a day, trying to entice people to not be so secretive about that. But, so we've tried to work through some strategies to improve whether or not people are giving us correct information. And that's a challenge. And so if it's a challenge for us, I would guess it's a challenge for other people too. But.
So this will lead me to a question. This measure really focuses within this set of data on COC funded programs, which wouldn't include emergency shelter. I still think it's a big challenge for you all. What about for our COC funded partners? Do you struggle in getting accurate updates on income?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, because they don't want to have to pay rent.
I mean, I remember from my own experiences, but just leaving the door open for possibly something has changed since my direct service days.
Well, and I hear a lot of the guys talking about trying to make money under the table so they don't have to report that. And of course, we don't get that, even though it would be a boost to,
Because like even if we were to do something like try to utilize an employment or income verification service, first of all, it's going to be something that costs us money to access and use. But then if someone's getting paid under the table, it's still not going to be something that we're going to see.
A lot of times it's not people like with a W-2 job, it's people doing landscape or doing construction that are just getting paid cash.
I would echo that experience.
I think a good percentage receives disability as well, so they may have income coming in, but you don't see the growth. So I think in terms of strategies, it's easier said than done, but trying to increase their, but they can still work, so trying to identify who would work and maybe increase that.
I'm trying to think about how we can
And they'll say,
incentivize people with
I'm
working
disabled, I
income.
can't work.
Right.
Like they, once they get
Yeah,
that check,
so I
they
think
don't want to
That
work.
becomes a challenge in terms of, in terms of measures, because I think there are people who are on that. I did,
Yep.
I think accessibility is also, going back to the original discussion about ways of townhomes. I think accessibility is a big barrier. I think there's a significant, seems to be a growing issue as far as being able to identify units that those have accessibility issues.
I remember struggling with that 10 years ago, and I was coming across far fewer people that had the need. We seem to be moving in a direction where we're seeing a lot more persons that have that need, and we're not seeing the level of accessible units increase at the same rate or even a similar rate.
Well, the ones that are, they can't have background check for.
Well, and like, do we even have a PSH acuity level program that doesn't require chronic homelessness status? Because I know we've talked about this before, because if you're looking at length of time, it's your first time homeless.
Yeah.
Well, HUD wants you in 90 days, but you're not eligible for anything until you're...
So, and as long as we are reliant for housing on HUD dollars, we're pretty much going to be looking at folks that have to meet that definition. So what that requires, and that's something that I know I've advocated for, I know Councilmember Sheehan has advocated for, we very much would like to see at some point local investments in permanent supportive housing, so we had some more flexibilities into who could be served in that category. We wouldn't have to necessarily only serve individuals that meet HUD's definition. And then it would be as simple as inserting those into our policies for coordinated entry and just setting requirements for that particular resource that might be a little bit different than our other PSH programs, we definitely need to look at where else we can find the funding other than the COC program. It's a great tool, but it can't be our only solution. I'm gonna cap this conversation. If we have additional time, we'll come back to it. I'm gonna go ahead and move us forward to the next agenda item. So, Dylan, I believe we did not have an opportunity to work on this yet, so we are not going to have a report on returns to homelessness review. We will make that a priority to present to you at the next meeting, which brings us to the housing triage system, and Marissa has an updated report for us for Q2 of calendar year 23.
So this is for the calendar year. I wasn't here for last time. You should see that report in front of you. It is the blue Excel sheets. But I personally don't think that that's very nice to look at. So instead, I put the information in here. So each blue dot represents a referral made, not just the individual, but the actual referral. So you can see in April, we had 10 referrals through coordinated entry that were made, 12 in May, and then 3 in June. So going from kind of where those referrals went to, you can see each color is coordinated based upon the referral for the program. Yellow being Shelter Plus Care with Lexington Housing Authority. Orange is the joint project with Community Action Council, Arbor Youth, ESD Rapid Rehousing, CAC, DV Bonus, etc. Dividing it up, you can see that 40% of our referrals were for rapid rehousing projects and 60 were for permanent supportive housing projects, with the majority of those being with Lexington Housing Authority Shelter Plus Care projects. They had some individual staff turnover, and because of that, obviously they had several referrals that were not made until kind of at once when that new person was hired in. So that accounts for the bulk of those PSH referrals, as well as with Mount Comprehensive Care, as well as New Vista's PSH project. So dividing that up by when those referrals were made, the majority of them, as I stated, were made in April, then May. And then June, we only had 3 referrals, including 1 Lexington Housing Authority Shelter Plus Care referral. Looking at acuity within our rapid rehousing, which again would be over here, the majority of those referrals scored within 7, as you can see. The average was 6.4, with our lowest being 5, and our highest was 10. That highest within rapid rehousing was 8. That referral that scored an 8 was for Project Independence, and that referral was one that was discussed during those coordinated entry by name meetings as a way to quickly ensure that this individual would not return to potentially unsheltered homelessness. And this is an individual that has very special circumstances. Concerning PSH, our permanent supportive housing referrals, the majority of those were 10. You can see there, with our average being 10.2. The highest acuity score was 14. So in terms of household compositions, you can see that most are individuals. Like I said, each dot represents a referral made, not necessarily one individual. So all of those in that top row right here are individual. Along the bottom is divided by month for the calendar year Q2. Households were next. They composed of 24% of those referrals, as opposed to the 68% of referrals that were individuals. And then the remaining 8% of referrals were families, and those were for Project Independence and Community Action Council's DBVI project as partnered with Greenhouse 17. So obviously our goal is to design a system that quickly reacts to homelessness. Our set number goal is 30, and that is ending the occurrence of homelessness within 30 days of presentation. But our average length of time in actuality is 202 days, so a far cry from that 30. However, the majority of which do fit into that 1 to 30 day mark, with half of our referrals being within 100 days of entering onto coordinated entry. So these numbers are from the time that they entered onto the coordinated entry project to the time that they received the referral. This does not necessarily mean housing move-in, just the time that they actually received that referral for housing placement. And you can see that we have a couple on the right-hand side that are bringing that number way up. So, almost all of our rapid rehousing, which is that bottom number right here, this is the same, just separated out for the time that it takes to receive a referral. Almost all of our rapid rehousing referrals are occurring within that 100 days, which is great. The whole point of rapid rehousing is that it is in fact rapid. It is rapidly moving folks towards housing. However, you can see for PSH a little less timely, only 2 were within that 1 to 30 day time frame, and the rest pretty much scattered throughout. This is a little bit different. Again, that starting point that we're looking at is the date that they first entered onto the coordinated entry project. However, now we're looking at the date that they actually were entered into the housing project. So this means that eligibility was determined, they are accepted into the housing project, and a search for housing move-in is set to occur. You can see that it's also not very timely, and it doesn't quite meet that 30-day mark. It's a little bit longer at 207 days from the time that people enter onto the coordinated entry within the coordinated entry project in HMIS to the time that they are actually accepted into that housing project. So if you are on those by name list meetings, if you are receiving referrals from myself, that's part of the reason why there are those continual updates to ensure that folks are entered into the project, that eligibility is being determined as quickly as possible. And then lastly, just because I thought this would be interesting to include, and it's not necessarily on the report itself, which is just a breakdown of the referring organization. So this is the organization that is helping with determining eligibility, potentially helping with gathering documentation, trying to make those connections with the individual or household or family, with the housing provider. A lot of our shelter plus care is in assistance with the New Vista Drop-In Center. Part of that is because that project does not come with supportive services, so supportive services have to be separate. And then you can see kind of throughout Arbor Youth, CAC, that includes their Assertive Street Outreach team. Hope Center also includes the Assertive Street Outreach team, as well as folks at the emergency shelter. And then lastly, the only other thing that I would kind of bring to everyone's attention is less pretty now, just the block of text and numbers, is that the folks that were actually successfully moved in. These are folks that were moved in from this time frame, so April through June, even if, like, for example, like a referral was made back in March, but then they actually moved in. So that's something to keep in mind. I want it to be quick, that way we can get out of here in a timely manner. I'm happy to talk further about any of this.
Can you share the link to that presentation?
Yes. Okay, then I will move on. The next thing, I think it's me still.
Yeah.
The next thing is just regarding HMIS interface changes. If you have logged into HMIS, you may notice that it looks a little different. I took these stills in order to make sure that the packet was sent out in a timely fashion 1 week ago. These stills are actually from the training site, so you may notice a couple of visual differences between the training site and the live site. Again, I want to explicitly state that functionality has remained completely the same. You go through all the same motions as you would when HMIS looked like it had not been updated since 1990. It's exactly the same, it just has a facelift. Some things just to keep in mind is that the website address is still the same. WellSky let us know that they are probably thinking about a change to the website. Right now it's currently that service point. It probably will change to community services. However, that URL change probably will occur at the end of the year, so we still have nearly 6 months. And then for some time thereafter, it will, if you go to the old website, the Service Point website through WellSky, it will push you to their new website. However, when those changes occur, I will obviously let you know. Enter data as mode, backdate mode, and search is all the same. Again, moving away from like client point, resource point, everything now should just say like clients, resources, service, etc. Reports still operate the same. The reports page looks pretty much identical to what it looked like before. The only thing to be aware of is that when you are pulling reports, sometimes it can be a little hard to see. I find that depending on your monitor screen, and just because it's now a lighter interface, it's not quite so primary colors. If you have anybody or even you yourself need any kind of assistance in accessibility regarding visibility, I find that just I use Chrome, so a Chrome extension for high visibility. I checked it on the live site and it works really, really well. But I'm happy to also explore other options. I've also provided WellSky with notice too that they probably should take into account visibility, accessibility when creating these interface changes, and I was informed that that will be passed along. However, I'm not sure if it will be an update soon. So if you have visibility, accessibility, please let me know. Especially that way I can tell WellSky that's not just me who can't see. Other things that I know that, for example, when attaching releases of information, any kind of attachments are a paper clip, not a binder clip. Please be aware that you still need to do that. And then when filling text, you may see a little triangle in the bottom right-hand corner that can expand and contract as needed. So if you see your text disappearing, it probably just needs to expand. Any questions about the interface changes with HMIS?
They went from the 90s to like early 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
It has like frosted tips.
getting a little closer.
Yeah.
Saying reminds me of college. It looks pretty good. I can echo that statement about it becoming visual noise though, with the background being white like that. I can hardly read it.
And where there is gray, it's like a very light shade of gray that almost looks identical to the white.
Yeah, it's like the scene from American Psycho, like, oh, it's eggshell. You know?
Yeah.
It's white. I can't tell. Like, I can't see the difference.
I completely agree. I personally use like a high visibility when I'm working on it because I find that it's pretty hard to actually see. So.
But hopefully they fix that in 7 or 8 years. So.
Yeah, we'll hold our breath for that. Any other questions regarding the interface changes? As Well Sky rolls out additional changes, allegedly, some functionality changes, we
I'll
will,
never believe it.
yeah, we will be sure that we include that here as well as.
I've been hearing about the
blast.
change to that login screen since 2018.
I've been hearing since
A login
pre-pandemic,
screen took 5 years to change.
it's like HMIS is going to be easier. They're changing it all. 6 months, it's going to be easier. 6 months goes by, it's like nothing's changed. 3 years go by, nothing's changed.
Yeah.
The good thing is we do think that they are hearing our concerns a little bit more. I know that KHC did go back and kind of push on the contract a little bit to try to make sure that we're actually getting what's specified in the contract. We did some conversations and some light exploration of other vendors, and the feedback that we're getting is incredibly costly, incredibly lengthy transitions to other systems, and we're hearing that a lot of other systems are going to have similar issues in that some are also going to have a more limited capacity to generate some of the data submissions that we need to produce. So at the present time, WellSky does still seem like a decent option. But, you know, the share of communities that are using WellSky has decreased significantly over the last 10 years or so, and so I think they're feeling the pressure to step up.
If they would just make the EDA a pop-up, because I feel like that's the number one thing. People forget to do that. They'll enter all kinds of information. And
They
then
love
it's
to make
lost.
backdate mode a pop-up, which you have to exit out of, and if you're on your phone, it's a nightmare to try to find it. And the thing is, functionality-wise, backdate mode is a little bit less important because a lot of times it will automatically timestamp based on the date of the enrollment. Whereas EDA, if you incorrectly EDA, it has much greater impact.
Yeah, so if they would fix EDA and if they would fix where the prior living situation did not carry forward, that's the one thing I've like.
We did
totally
specifically
canned.
request that KHC explore if there's the ability to eliminate and somehow automate EDA mode. We were told we're stuck with it.
That's the word, that's the number one issue. If they fix just that, it would be so much easier. It's not really hard to enter the information. It's just that remembering that EDA mode. And it's not even, it's, you know, up here. It's not even in your face.
I will be glad to provide them with that feedback.
Oh, please do.
Yeah.
Please do. Tell them it's awful.
Is there anything else? Okay, the next thing on the agenda is the new user training that is occurring August 10th, so 1 week from tomorrow. If you have any HMIS users that need to attend that training, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll send that calendar invite, and then also expect to see them at that time. The next item, any questions about that? Okay, great. The next item of business is the end user group. That is occurring on September 12th at 2. That user group meeting will be recorded and distributed for all of our HMIS users because we will be talking in depth about the changes that they should expect to see for HMIS data standards regarding fiscal year 2024, which will be starting on October 1st of 2023. So be aware that some changes to HMIS, to our APR and the CAPER will be implemented, and we'll talk in depth about those changes as well as changes to universal data elements, what to expect. And hopefully, because it is closer to that October 1st date, there will be less likelihood of HUD changing those right before those go into effect.
And I'm sure WellSky will have it in our system at midnight on October 1st, so bear with us and give us a day or two to turn it around.
Any questions or concerns about that? That is via Zoom. So if you need that calendar invite or feel like you're not included on those email blasts concerning HMIS, please let me know. Lastly, I want to thank everybody for completing their annual license renewal documentation and getting that to me. I think that we have, or I've spoken with every single organization regarding that, so that should all be complete. So thank you all so much for getting that to me on time. And that is all for my HMIS announcements.
Other issues or public sharing as we close out the meeting?
I would like to announce my new outreach coordinator, Dustin, who you all know already, but he will be taking that position going forward, so that will be on
Great news.
having him hire the rest of the people. So.
Hope Center's agreement went into effect yesterday. So they're working on getting their staffing ramped up, and we're excited to be able to have the ability to do some outreach, expanded hours. Definitely, I know I tell him, but share my congratulations to Dustin. We really appreciate his work. Other announcements? I think we're all about meeting out. So we'll go ahead, and is there a motion to adjourn? All right, I think I got my motion and my second all at once.